All right, I'm going to get going. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 2 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat, editor-in-chief of mxdwn.com. That's Mixdown. This is our second episode. Last week was our first, kind of an experiment in trial by fire. This is going to be a show where we recap the headlines, we tell a story, and then maybe eventually we'll have some special guests. No special guests yet today. For now, we're just going to have a story, and we're going to recap some of the biggest entertainment headlines of the week. Usually, we would go with the story first. This week's story is a little bit intense, so we're going to start with the headlines, and then we're going to come back to the story, which I'm affectionately calling Milquetoast. So, first, the headlines for this week. Top story, Smashing Pumpkins, alternative rock legends, have announced a, no kidding, 33-song follow-up album to their classic 90s albums, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, and Machina, Machines of God. This is intended to be something of a sequel to those classic Love Struck records, and it is going to be released in small doses as the months go on. Over in the world of games, Rockstar Games has been the victim of a terrible and heinous act of basically hacking. Some hacker has been able to penetrate one of their machines or one of their programmers or coders' machines using their Slack communication portal. And as a result of that, this hacker basically leaked something in the neighborhood of 90 different clips of footage from the game and put them up on a message board. And this is unfinished material, stuff that hints at plot, stuff that nobody really should be seeing because the company hasn't finished the game. But there it is. This hacker has also claimed that he has more, and if he is to be believed, and that he is the one that actually has this material, claims he has more and is probably most likely ransoming Rockstar, or he'll release more of it. Rockstar is expected to do a thorough review of their security apparatuses in terms of how this person was able to gain access to the material. In the realm of live to streaming movies and TVs, Ryan Murphy's announced his latest crime saga, which is based on the true story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the convicted murderer and sometimes cannibal. In this particular feature, Dahmer himself will be played by Evan Peters, who many of you know for his role recently in Mayor of Easttown, and before that as Quicksilver in the Fox-centric X-Men movies, not certainly the Disney Marvel Cinematic Universe X-Men movies that are bound to happen. Also in this story is Niecy Nash, who some of you might know from her time in the improv, I guess you could call it improv, wonderful show Reno 911 from Comedy Central, and also 80s favorite from the John Hughes era, Molly Ringwald. In the world of movies, Jeff Loveness has been announced to be the writer for the next Avengers film, Avengers: The Kang Dynasty. This is already his second project, writing for a Marvel Cinematic Universe feature, as he wrote the script for Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which is almost finished, but not yet released. Apparently, Marvel is happy enough with his work that they're putting him with one of their biggest franchise tentpole picks, and this is a part of the massive saga of Kang the Conqueror. And big Marvel Studios fans will remember that Kang was introduced in a form as He Who Remains, played by Jonathan Majors of Lovecraft Country fame, recently in the very successful show Loki, the 6-part episode show that was released on Disney+. Jeff Loveness will write alongside Destin Daniel Cretton, who will be directing. Destin Daniel Cretton was also recently the director of Shang-Chi and The Legend of the Ten Rings. Lastly, Hank Williams III. Some of you may not know, some of you may. Hank Williams III is the grandson of the legendary Hank Williams, the son of Bocephus, Hank Williams Jr., and has been a Mixdown favorite since the early days of Mixdown. Hank III is a mix of hardcore outlaw alt country, but then also tours usually with a death metal band, Ashjack, at times even other more intricate and insane things like auctioneer cattle calling, and also incredible like stoner rock doom metal. But mostly, if you saw Hank 3 live, you know that half the show was outlaw country, half the show was death metal. Hank 3 has also been a part of other projects such as Superjoint Ritual in the past and Arson Anthem, but hasn't really done anything in a long time and has been super conspicuous by his absence. The last time Hank 3 released an album was in 2013, and there's been very little word and no tours in the time since. Over the last few days and starting over the weekend, Hank 3 started posting songs onto his YouTube account for the first time in years. Many of them are updated versions of older songs or perhaps demos of versions of the songs that no one's ever heard. But at least 2 songs in the mix are songs that nobody's ever heard before. One called Die for Freedom, which includes an incredibly spooky and alt-government, anti-government sample, and another one called Through the Day, which he listed as a tribute to people suffering with heroin addiction. Ultimately, Hank 3 was responsible for one of the better records that we heard in the early 2000s and the aughts, which was his double album, Straight to Hell. But now, suddenly, without explanation, he started releasing music in a fury through his YouTube. That's all the headlines for this week. But now we're going to shift into this week's story. Now, as I mentioned before, the story is called Milquetoast. The reason it's called Milquetoast is because of the Helmet song bearing the same name, which, coincidentally and interestingly, bears 2 different spellings. The conventional Milquetoast, Toast, and then a more, I guess, common spelling of it, Milktoast. Now, this song holds a special place in my heart, and here's why. Now, when I was young, we grew up in Connecticut, mostly rural Connecticut, somewhere near the foot of the mountains. And it's a small town. School, has regular school. There's a few different schools, elementary school, middle school, high school. And effectively, there'd be a bus system. And of course, Connecticut's weather is usually terrible. It's very cold in the winter. It's very hot in the summer. It's very rarely ever nice. So, unless you're really close to school, walking to school isn't a thing. So especially when you live up the hill like I did, you ultimately have to take the bus and go to school. Now this, at this point in my life, was something of a complete nightmare. Starting from decently early age, maybe not 5 years old, but somewhere in the 8, 9, 10 age kind of bracket, this became a pretty awful experience for me personally. Now, on the one hand, my sister and I would often sit out there waiting for the bus, and the bus driver in our particular route was super unpredictable. Never knew if she was going to come or not. And sometimes we'd sit there for a better part of an hour and a half, and she just wouldn't come. Other times, we'd be standing there waiting for the bus, and she would just drive right by us. And then we'd have to, slink back inside and ostensibly say to our father, the bus left us. We never really knew why. Now, the worst part of it for me, though, personally, thankfully my sister was spared from most of this, was basically nonstop ridicule in a torturous way. When I would get on the bus in my age, coming into that time, I guess nobody liked me, or they thought it was weird or ugly or fat or who knows what. Basically, it was that kind of thing, walking down the aisles of the bus, looking for a place to sit, not really caring, just knowing you need to sit on the bus. And basically, if there was even open seats, nobody would let me sit. And it'd be a thing where I'd end up all the way at the back of the bus. Sometimes basically being ridiculed the entire way through. Now, this became like a ritual habit for the people who lived up my street in the neighborhood where I lived. And it basically became this, he's the gross person. Don't be near him. Don't be anywhere around him. And effectively, no one wanted to be seated or seen near me. I, don't know really entirely why. I wouldn't even pretend to know. But I guess that just goes with the territory if you're unpopular or if people don't like you or they think you're gross or stupid. And ultimately, in those days, I basically just made the best of it. It was pretty awful. Probably for a good 4 or 5 years. It went like that, where almost every day, the only hope that I had was that somebody was sick, and thus there'd be an open seat all the way at the back of the bus. Now, when I was 8 and 9 and 10, there was nothing I could do but just kind of shoulder through it, live through it, sit and take it. And of course, most of the bus rides going from my house to Short Run to school, basically being harassed, harangued, made fun of, called fat, called ugly, called faggot, whatever it was that people felt would probably hurt me the most. And effectively, it just kind of became, this is my world, right? When you're at that age, you don't really have a choice. You go to school. School's what you do. You're supposed to be in school. You're supposed to be at school. You're supposed to take the bus to school. Your parents got jobs to do. They've got to make a living. They got to put, food on the table. So there really wasn't any thought of there's some other way to do this. It wasn't close enough to walk to school. My parents at that age weren't really comfortable with me walking several miles alone down a series of very tall hills to where the school was. So living with the ridicule basically became my life for many, many years. And of course, by the time that wonderful teen angst era kicked in, it became its own form of malevolent torture. And it became something that was incredibly painful, basically having to go through it every day. Now, I can't remember exactly when, but somewhere probably around 1991, I got what was becoming common at that point, which was portable compact disc players. And portable compact disc players were essentially, you know, a brand new thing at the time. They were buggy. They didn't really work that well. You hit a bump on the road, they'd skip. But at this time, this is for you young people that might end up watching this video or hearing this audio. You didn't have iPods. You didn't have iPhones. There wasn't streaming. You had to own the CD. You had to have a portable Discman, and you had to have batteries to play it. Otherwise, you didn't get to listen to any music. So sometime around probably 1991, 92, for Christmas, got a portable CD player. And then basically that became my lifeline. The way that I made it through those years and basically having to go to school where I didn't want to go, to be around people I definitely didn't want to be around, was to have this CD player and listen to music. And, you know, from my memory, some of it's just kind of an awful blur, a smush of just crap. I can't say all of the things, what happened, what was said, but I do remember that for many years, even with a CD player and headphones, I could hear them still saying things to me, even over the audio, even right inside my ears. And mostly I just tried to exist in that world. I tried to pretend what was happening as some form of cognitive dissonance wasn't happening. Now, somewhere around this phase, the 1994 movie The Crow is about to come out, starring Brandon Lee, and the incredible tragedy that is the story of that movie. I'm sure most of you know how he was shot to death accidentally by a prop gun on the set and ultimately passed away, and they had to finish the movie without him right as he was about to become famous. The film was directed by Alex Proyas, and it's a wonderful little piece of counterculture history from the 90s, from what was a burgeoning Brandon Lee as the star, as Draven the Crow. Now, synergies were common in the music industry at that time. There were other soundtracks that had all kinds of interesting bands like the Flintstones or Judgment Night. But The Crow was probably the grand champion as far as soundtracks with synced licensed music or originally created music. And in this particular instance, there was a slew of very successful songs that came from it. Pantera did a cover of Poison Idea's The Badge. There was The Cure doing Burn, which is still a very popular Cure song all the way to this day. There was the very famous Stone Temple Pilots song, Big Empty. Nine Inch Nails had their cover of Joy Division, Dead Souls. And also there was even a Rage Against the Machine song called Darkness that most people don't remember before Rage Against the Machine became popular. I was also personally a fan of the band My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, and they had a song called After the Flesh on that soundtrack that's really good. There's a ton of stuff. If you've never heard that soundtrack, go listen to it. There's also things, Violent Femmes have the song on there, Machines of Loving Grace. Pretty critically for me, in this phase, was the song Milquetoast by the band Helmet. Helmet, at this point, to give you a little bit of a context, was kind of an everyday man kind of rock band in a time of like very dark, spooky heavy metal and then very grungy, you know, downtrodden alternative and grunge music. Helmet was, I mean, you can't really call them alternative. You can't really call them metal. They're certainly not a pop band. It's just four guys playing instruments with distortion and, you know, pretty straight ahead music. Really wasn't a gimmick in any particular sense that was very common in those days in terms of how things were genreified. But they were led by their singer, guitar player, Paige Hamilton. And most of Helmet's songs in those days, at least, were using what it was known by guitar players at the time as a drop D tuning. And essentially that just meant the bass string on the guitar, the lowest string, was tuned down one whole note to D instead of to E. And effectively, it gave you different flexibility as far as open chords. It gave you different flexibility as far as where, you know, your root was in terms of the open string. And then it also meant for, instead of the conventional, you know, flat five power chords that people might play, it became kind of a different animal in terms of, you know, one finger having a different flexibility in terms of how you went up and down the neck. So a lot of bands in that time quite avidly use this drop D tuning, and sometimes even a more advanced, even lower drop C tuning. We won't even go into that. But most Helmet songs in that day, in those times, were using this drop D tuning, and Milquetoast was no different. Now, Milquetoast, and as it's known on the Crow soundtrack, Milquetoast, just for the record, Milquetoast was basically an exercise in what I think a lot of alternative bands were famous for in those days. The Pixies made this famous in their own right in the early 90s, which was called Loud, Quiet, Loud, which meant that you had kind of an intro, something that got people's attention really quickly. All the heavy guitars kind of dissipated, and you had a bass line and a drum pattern and a drum rhythm. And then at some point, as the chorus or subsequent choruses kicked in, eventually the harder rocking kind of alt rock stuff would kind of return. Milquetoast is that kind of a song. It starts out right away, kind of introducing a theme, and then it shifts to the theme, everything disappearing except for the bass line, as Page Hamilton kind of ghostly sings a series of lyrics. There's maybe only about 6 lines of lyrics in the entire song before a different interpretation, of the melody comes in with electric guitars. And effectively, it becomes kind of an exercise in shifting between these different, approaches to the melody, the 2 or 3 melodies that they're juggling between. I couldn't tell you to this day what the lyrics of the song are about. I don't think I've ever really known. I mean, you could maybe, if you dig deep into it, and for some kind of deep distaste with the way things are done, how the Burgess of Society tends to approach things, but I wouldn't hazard a guess just from, straight up reading the lyrics. Ultimately, in this time, though, what this was, for me, especially as a person who started playing guitar as a means of escape, started listening to music as a means of escape, this was like water for a man dying of thirst, is the way I would put it. And effectively, Page Hamilton's songwriting, what was happening in this song, was kind of a mix of these open chord kind of drop detuning bar chord, different shifts and slides. And then eventually what he, always kind of had in his songwriting, or he's mentioned in terms of his personal time playing guitar, was a lot of open jazz chords. So you have this pretty straight ahead rock song with a lot of distortion, shifting between a deeper kind of chugging open closed riff. And then as the song builds to its crescendo, a whole series of distorted jazz chords as it builds to a bigger and bigger and bigger crescendo on through the end. Now, as I was going through these times, basically, at some point, I found the Crow soundtrack. I think originally I bought it because 9 Inch Nails was on it. I was into 9 Inch Nails at that point, as a lot of people were that were into, rock or alternative music. And, I liked a lot of the songs in the record, but for whatever reason, Milquetoast was the song that I kept coming back to. And I kind of had this little kind of relationship with it where I was good enough at guitar to do something, could learn the opening lick of Blind Melon's No Rain, but I couldn't really play the guitar solo, and I could do enough to be able to play some songs I was familiar with. And I used to spend, because I had the guitar tablature from some guitar magazine in those days, I used to spend every afternoon after I got home from school just trying to get it right, just trying to learn the different chords that made up the song and trying to figure out how they came up with the ideas to put all this stuff together. And it's one of those great points in music where it's deceptively simple. I wouldn't call it in any way anything that is insanely complex, but at the same time, how they shift between these 2 or 3 different melodic ideas and then just take it all into a way to build to this massive cathartic release through kind of an unusual approach to jazz chords, just distorted jazz chords, which usually you let the whole chord ring, or, you hit as an arpeggio certain notes in them. There's a lot of different ways to use them, of course, but typically speaking, you're not strumming really fast with distortion over them, all these different versions of it, and having 2 different people kind of doing 2 different things. And ultimately then building to your expected, explosive rock finale of the main introductory riff, or a slightly different version of it. And I remember that once I found this song, and of course the other songs that were on the Crow soundtrack, but very specifically this song, this is what I did every single morning to get through that bus ride. I remember that I would come on and I'd hear people start saying horrible things to me the second I stood on the bus, the second I started walking down the aisle. And then effectively, as I came down the aisle and, sat in my chair, I put my headphones on and I just tried not to pay attention to it. It was kind of its own form of escape in the middle of, I don't know, abuse, or I don't know what word is appropriate. In those days, the only thing we would ever say is you were being made fun of. No one really ever called it anything other than that. Oh, they're making fun of you. So as I was going through that, I just pushed my headphones on, far less good headphones than the ones that are on my head right now, by the way. And effectively, I would just listen to that song over and over again, trying to figure out what Page Hamilton was doing and trying to figure out how I could replicate it. And then thinking to myself, wow, school sucks. I really don't want to be at school because, school, like the bus, was the place that allowed these things to happen. The people that were in charge, the teachers, the bus drivers, they knew this stuff happened. It was fine for them. They didn't have any problem with it. Maybe it was just an effort to try to remove undesirable people. Maybe they just didn't care. I don't want to speculate for their intent and their purpose. But ultimately, I knew this has been going on for years. If they're cool with that, I'm not cool with them. I don't want to be a part of any world that would allow something like this to happen. So I would basically take that bus trip and then probably a good degree of my classes and think to myself, I can't wait to go back home so that I can pick up my guitar and try to learn the licks at Milquetoast and be able to play it all the way through. That was the only way that I think I got through that time until eventually something even worse happened. And then I ostensibly stopped taking the bus out completely. I either went to my father's store or, at that point, I think I finally had a mountain bike and I would just ride my bike home instead of taking the bus. And that's when that all finally ended. But I do remember from an embryonic sense, it was a critical point in my story as far as it was my own little world. And it basically clicked to me that in spite of what I was seeing in front of me, and in spite of how distasteful what I was experiencing every day was, that there was ways to create other worlds, and that the world that was didn't need to be the world that I existed in. And that was the beginning of starting to think about life purely from a sense of maybe there's a way to make my own reality. Not through any magical means or anything silly, but just literally step by step, piece by piece. Maybe there's worlds beyond this world. Maybe there's a different way of handling things. Maybe there's a different way of enforcing the way people approach each other, or just finding a different climate or a different environment where people aren't so particularly terrible. And that's ostensibly where it started for me. That was the beginning of how things started to change. And at least, if nothing else, how I started to change things for myself. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week and many weeks beyond with This Week is Live. Eventually, we might have guests, some people from Mixdown, other people from the industry interviews. But for now, we'll just continue in this fashion, telling stories, recapping headlines. Follow us on Twitch and on YouTube if you're interested. And also, thanks for stopping by. So glad to see you well.